Movie of the Year now at the Academy Awards. It's a privilege to present this award to Dr. Motto, who Dr. Motto was one of my instructors when I was in residency at SF General. And Dr. Kessler was my first instructor of psychiatry back in '68 when I was a med student coming out on a fellowship, so it's like an old home night for me. I reconnected with Dr. Motto during our task force on the Golden Gate Bridge barrier, where he started working with us in 2004. And Jerry has been involved in bridge suicide efforts for at least 30 plus years. And he has a very long career, and I think is delighted that finally we've come to fruition as far as seeing a barrier hopefully being erected. So, a little bit of background about Dr. Motto. He is currently a professor emeritus at UCSF. He's born in Kansas City, grew up in Southern California, graduated at UC Berkeley Phi Beta Kappa, studied medical science, went to UCSF Medical School, interned at the General, residency at Johns Hopkins and Langley Porter, and on the faculty of UC over 40 years. But most prominent about Dr. Motto is he is one of the world international experts on suicide. He's the past president of the American Association of Suicidology, and is currently, we sort of scooped them, but he's receiving from that organization, April 18th, the Marshall Linehan Award for Outstanding Research in Suicide Prevention. On an international level, he's the Secretary General of the International Association of Suicide Prevention. He is on the editorial board of Suicide and Life-Threatening Behavior and has been a principal investigator with NIMH. He's a Distinguished Life Fellow of the APA, and he's been on multiple advisory councils. I almost couldn't read the list for you. He's published over 100 papers on suicide, topics such as suicide prevention, assessment and risk of suicide, biological aspects of suicide, the relation with alcohol abuse, adolescence, the rational right to suicide, and the influence of the media on suicide. And let me maybe just cite two of his works. The first one is an article that I read where he looked at a study in Detroit when the newspapers were on strike. He noticed that the incidence of suicide had decreased. A very important reflection about how important it is, the suggestibility and effect of the press on suicide. Back probably, this is why the Chronicle in 1995 stopped publishing the names of bridge jumpers, because of the notorious fame, as they called it, of being in the papers. And Dr. Motto pointed out back in the early 70s how important the press was in their effect on the suggestibility of people with suicidal, and how important it was for the press to be presenting suicide in a rational manner. Another article from a book on from the Harvard series. This is by Dr. Jacobs in 1995. Dr. Motto wrote a chapter in there about suicide and the rational aspect, and most of us think about suicide as simply an issue of depression, but in the article he's talking about suicide as simply at times an issue of just burnout, where you've just overwhelmed, and it's not just a question of just a depression, but it can just be an effect of just an inability to cope, where you just sort of you're maxed out. So I've been working with Dr. Motto now for the last 5 years on our task force, and he's been always sort of the resident expert and the person to consult about suicide. He's here with his wife. There are 2 kids, three grandkids, and another grandkid en route. So I'm very privileged to present this award to Dr. Motto, which I will read for you. This is the Outstanding Achievement Award, Jerome Motto, for his long and distinguished career in psychiatry, his internationally acknowledged expertise in suicide and its prevention, for his perseverance in advocating for a suicide barrier on San Francisco's Golden Gate Bridge, including his dedicated service to the Psychiatric Foundation of Northern California's task force on this issue, and his role as the leading authority on suicide, its course, trends, and prevention. Dr. Motto.
Well, as my predecessors here, I am here to thank the organization for taking such a positive view of my career in psychiatry. When I think back at what are called accomplishments, I can't help but realize that what I did was, with the assistance of a great many persons. For example, the two first directors of the Langley Porter Psychiatric Institute and the Department of Psychiatry at UCSF, Carl Bowman and Alexander Simon, who gave me enormous administrative support with the open invitation, do whatever is of interest to you to do, and we will support you. And they did. I had the cooperation of 5 community mental health centers in San Francisco, who allowed our research assistants to participate, to interview suicidal persons, these persons who are at high risk for suicide, with the help of 5 research assistants who worked full-time for 5 years gathering data. I was also assisted by the invaluable help of Alan Bostrom, a biostatistician who made statistical sense of the findings that we had. I could call those all enabling supporters. They were invaluable. There's another category, though, and I think this might be of most interest to the persons here, what I'd call theoretical support. With an open invitation to follow my own inclinations in the academic world, where research is the name of the game, it occurred to me that no one had ever demonstrated a randomized, controlled study that showed an effective way to prevent suicide. And it seemed to me that that was long overdue. There was a certain amount of publications, of course, of works on suicide, but to this day, those works have focused on what I call descriptive type things, correlations, so that it was possible to find information about suicide rates in different countries, different age groups, different genders, different occupations. Almost any question that you might ask about the characteristics of persons at high risk for suicide, there's material that has been studied thoroughly. What one does not find, or certainly did not find at the time that I was faced with making choices about which direction to go in, what one does not find is how to prevent it. Well, I read a book that was published in 1965 by a German analyst named Helmut Kaiser. I've only met one person in my life who was acquainted with Helmut Kaiser. And yet, the bottom line in his book made an impression on me. The bottom line was very simple. It's the main regulator of emotional life is a sense of connection to something larger and beyond ourselves. This sense of connection is not a conscious awareness, but it is critical. Therefore, if a person comes to one with emotional problems, there's a universal pathology, a disturbance in this connection, which he called, colorfully enough, a delusion of fusion. A disturbance in the delusion of fusion. And therefore, there's a universal therapy, a reestablishment of the delusion of fusion. Well, I was in my first decade of professional experience at the time, and my immediate thought was, oh gosh, human emotional life is far more complicated than that. This guy's oversimplifying things. But as the years went by, and I talked with a lot of persons with emotional problems, and especially persons with suicidal impulses, I couldn't shake off the constant reminder of his words and coming to a feeling that, you know, I think Kaiser may have had a point. Well, putting that together with my awareness that it was necessary to find some kind of method to reduce suicide, we put together a project. Well, I must say that the project was supported by the National Institute of Mental Health, another source of help. Again, repeating that whatever I may have accomplished was with the help of a lot of other sources. You may be aware that the highest risk group for suicide is persons who have been hospitalized because of suicidal issues and discharged, and the first 2 years after their discharge, the suicide rates are the highest of any identified group. So we set up a program to look at this group. And our 5 research assistants generated over 3,000 subjects in the city of San Francisco from the 5 community mental health centers. And we determined which of them had refused ongoing care when they left the inpatient psychiatric services. There were about 900 of those who refused care. We divided that 900 randomly in 2. And when it came to the issue of what can we do as a means of reducing suicide, Helmut Kaiser came back to mind, and the thought was, how can we reestablish the delusion of fusion in this population? Well, I drew on other experience. During World War II, I was overseas in the service, and I had the experience of what's called a pen pal. Someone who would write short notes to me that were supportive. It wasn't someone that I was particularly interested in initially, but I found not having to respond under the circumstances, it wasn't always easy to respond. The person was always supportive. They made no requests of me. You know, tell me what you're doing, how are things going, et cetera, et cetera. After a while, that person became meaningful, a real source of support. Well, I thought we'd apply that to Helmut Kaiser. And we took half of our patients who had refused ongoing care, and we sent them a short note that said, "It's been some time since we've seen you. We hope things are going well. If you'd like to be in touch with us, we'd be happy to hear from you." And we enclosed a self-addressed envelope with no stamp on it, being aware that so many people are very sensitive to pressure, and putting a stamp on it would be putting pressure on them. And we set up a regular schedule, monthly for 4 months, bi-monthly for 8 months, tri-monthly for 4 more years. 5 years. The response was variable, as one might anticipate. Some persons we never heard from. There were 14 persons out of the 450 that we were in touch with, that we called our contact group, who requested not receiving any more letters, and we stopped those. Everyone else we continued for the 5 years. There was a phenomenon that came up that we called our kiss-off letter, where someone after about 1.5 years would send us a letter saying, "I'm fine, thanks," and sign their name. We took that to mean, okay, you've got a response now, you can hold off. But we did not hold off. We continued. If we got a response, then the next letter would reply to that response, of course. But the general tone of everyone was what we like to think of as caring letters. We never mentioned suicide. We never mentioned, are you feeling depressed? Or maybe you should resume therapy, or nothing that would have the form of any pressure of any kind, expressing only a caring about that person. And there is a subtle difference that I'm sure you're aware of between we care about you and we care about whether you're suicide or not. It's subtle, but it's important as we saw it. Well, we'd get some responses like, "You'll never know how much your little notes mean to me. My family kicked me out, but at least I know somebody cares." That gave us encouragement. Maybe Helmut had a point. Another letter came from a young man who had been in deep trouble with a suicide attempt and drug problems and all kinds of things, who sent off a kiss-off letter at 18 months. "I'm fine, thanks." But of course we continued. About 1 year later, we got a second communication from him that started out, "You're the most persistent son of a bitch I ever met, so you must be sincere in your interest in me." He gave us a rundown on his life with lots of details. Well, believe it or not, when the biostatistician compared the suicide after 5 years, that is 5 years after they were interviewed, between our contact group that had refused ongoing care and the no contact group that had refused ongoing care. The first 2 years, the most dangerous time, the contact group had less than half the suicide rate of the no contact group. And we got statistical significance, 0.01, that kind of thing. But it seemed that Kaiser had a valid point, which was remarkable. It also was observed that when our letters became less frequent, that is, every 3 months instead of every month, the curves of suicide rate became parallel instead of diverging as they did in the first 2 years. And then when we stopped them altogether after 5 years, the two came together, which gave us further evidence, not proof, but evidence that those what were termed caring letters were exerting a certain effect. Well, in crediting other persons, other institutions, other agencies for enabling some accomplishment to occur, got to give Helmut Kaiser a lot of credit there. And if any of my achievements were, quotes, outstanding, it was by virtue of mobilizing the time, the energy, the ideas of others. And for the opportunity to do so, that I'm eternally grateful. I'm also thankful and grateful to NCPS for its generous assessment of my career. So, again, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Motto. I'm really touched by the translation of that quote that you read and how it stayed with you and kind of transformed itself into a whole theoretical framework to carry out such an important and simple intervention. So thank you very much for that. So this concludes the formal part of our awards dinner. Thank you very much, all of you, for your kind attention, and congratulations to all the awardees.